Hey there, friend. Welcome to another journey through the dusty corridors of history, where we dig into the stories that textbooks somehow manage to make boring. I'm glad you found your way here tonight, whether you're winding down from a long day or seeking that gentle drift towards sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet here together, exploring the forgotten voices of the past. If this kind of slow, meandering historical storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you that peaceful feeling we're all chasing. Now, settle in. Pull that blanket a little closer. Let the day's worries fade like smoke in the evening air. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to ancient China, to one of humanity's most ambitious construction projects. But we're not here for the sweeping vistas or the tourist photos. No, we're here for the workers, the forgotten millions who bled and died to build what we now call the Great Wall of China. You've seen the pictures, the majestic stone serpent winding across misty mountains, a triumph of human engineering stretching thousands of miles across northern China. It's been called one of the wonders of the world, visible from space according to popular myth, though that's not actually true. But here's what the glossy documentaries and history books don't dwell on. Building this marvel was an absolute nightmare for the people who actually had to do it. The Great Wall, as we know it today, wasn't built all at once by a single dynasty. It's actually a patchwork of walls, fortifications, and barriers constructed over more than 2 millennia by various Chinese states and dynasties. But the period we're focusing on tonight, the era that truly earned the wall its reputation as a monument built on human suffering, began during the reign of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, around 220 BCE. Picture this. You're a farmer in ancient China, working a small plot of land, trying to feed your family. The seasons turn, the crops grow, and life follows the rhythm it has for generations. Then one day, imperial soldiers arrive at your village. They're not there for taxes this time, though those are crushing enough. No, they're there for you. The emperor has decreed that the northern borders must be fortified, that the scattered walls built by previous states must be connected and extended into one massive barrier. And you, whether you like it or not, are going to help build it. This wasn't voluntary. This was conscription on a scale that would make modern military drafts look like gentle suggestions. The Qin dynasty, and later dynasties that continued the work, operated on a simple principle. If you were male, able-bodied, and between the ages of about 15 and 60, you could be called up to work on the wall. Some estimates suggest that at the height of construction, over 1 million men were laboring on various sections simultaneously. 1 million human beings, torn from their families, their farms, their lives, and marched to the edges of the known world to move rocks. But let's slow down a moment. Let's really understand what this meant for an ordinary person. Imagine you're that farmer we mentioned. The soldiers give you perhaps a day to gather what belongings you can carry. Your wife weeps, knowing she may never see you again, and she's not being dramatic. The mortality rate for wool workers was staggering. Your children cling to your legs, confused about why Papa has to go away. You kiss them goodbye, and it feels like saying farewell to your entire world, because in many ways, it is. The march to your assigned section of the wall could take weeks or even months, depending on where you lived and where you were needed. You walk hundreds of miles on foot, carrying your tools, your meager possessions, and what food you've been able to bring. The imperial administrators who organized these massive movements of humanity weren't particularly concerned with your comfort or survival during the journey. If you fell ill, if you couldn't keep up, if you died along the way, well, there were plenty more farmers where you came from. And this is where the scale of human suffering really begins to sink in. We're not talking about a few thousand workers on a short-term project. We're talking about generation after generation of Chinese men, millions upon millions over the centuries, whose lives were consumed by this endless construction project. Sons followed fathers to the wall. Grandsons died building the same sections their grandfathers had started. Entire family lines were broken on those northern mountains. When you finally arrived at your designated worksite, what you found was a scene that would have looked familiar to workers on the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the building sites of medieval cathedrals, except worse, much worse. At least those projects were built in relatively hospitable locations. The Great Wall snaked through some of the most inhospitable terrain in China. Barren deserts, frozen mountains, rocky highlands, where the wind never stopped howling and where winter temperatures could kill a man in minutes. The logistics alone were nightmarish. Imagine trying to build a massive stone fortification in places where there were no roads, no nearby towns, no infrastructure whatsoever. Every brick, every tool, every grain of rice had to be carried by human hands across impossible terrain. The wall wasn't just built by human labor, it was supplied by human labor. Long chains of workers stretching back towards civilization, passing materials hand to hand like some grim relay race that never ended. And the materials themselves were backbreaking. We often think of the Great Wall as being built of stone, and much of it was, but different sections used different materials depending on what was locally available. In some areas, workers quarried and hauled massive stone blocks. In others, they made bricks from local clay and fired them in kilns. In desert regions, they built with sand and gravel, held together with whatever binding agents they could find. But regardless of the material, it was heavy, and it had to be moved entirely by human muscle power. The working day began before dawn and ended after sunset. There were no weekends, no holidays, no sick days. You worked until you dropped, literally in many cases. The pace was relentless because the emperor's demands were relentless. Each section of wall had quotas to meet, distances to complete within specified timeframes. Fall behind, and punishments were swift and brutal. The imperial supervisors weren't building a wall. They were fighting a war against the landscape itself, and the workers were their ammunition. Food was scarce and of poor quality. The supply lines that brought provisions to remote work sites were constantly stretched thin. Workers survived on thin gruel, mouldy grain, and whatever small animals or plants they could forage from the surrounding wasteland. Malnutrition was endemic. Men who had been strong farmers became walking skeletons within months of arriving at the wall. Scurvy, beriberi, and other diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies swept through work camps like wildfire. Medical care was virtually non-existent. If you broke a bone hauling stones, if you crushed your hand in a quarry accident, if you fell from scaffolding, you were on your own. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lingered, unable to work but unable to leave, slowly starving in corners of work camps, while their fellow laborers, too exhausted and desperate to help, stepped over their bodies to get to their own daily assignments. The weather was another constant enemy. Summer brought scorching heat in the desert sections and swarms of insects everywhere. Workers toiled under the blazing sun with no protection, no shade, no respite. Heat stroke claimed thousands. Winter was even deadlier. In the mountainous regions, temperatures plunged well below freezing. Workers had inadequate clothing, insufficient shelter, and no way to warm themselves. They froze to death in their sleep, and their bodies were often simply built into the wall itself, rather than being carried away for burial. And speaking of burial, the Great Wall has earned its grim nickname as the longest cemetery on Earth, for good reason. Conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of workers died during its construction, though some historians believe the true number may be over 1 million. When a worker died, there was rarely time or resources for a proper funeral. Bodies were buried hastily in shallow graves nearby, or in many cases, simply incorporated into the wall's foundation. The wall, in a very literal sense, is built on the bones of the men who constructed it. But death wasn't the only escape workers dreamed of. Some tried to flee, to make the dangerous journey back to their homes and families. Desertion was punishable by death, not just for the deserter, but often for his family as well. The imperial government wasn't taking any chances with their workforce. Still, desperate men took desperate risks. Most who tried to escape were caught and executed as examples to the others. Their bodies, like those of workers who died from exhaustion or disease, often ended up as part of the wall itself. The psychological toll was perhaps as devastating as the physical one. These weren't soldiers who had volunteered for a glorious campaign. These were farmers, craftsmen, labourers who had been torn from everything they knew and loved and forced into what amounted to a death sentence. Many went mad from the isolation, the hopelessness, the endless repetition of back-breaking work with no end in sight. Some threw themselves from the wall rather than continue living. Others simply sat down one day and refused to move, accepting whatever punishment came rather than lifting another stone. Letters home, when they were possible at all, tell heartbreaking stories of men who knew they would never see their families again, but still clung to hope. They wrote of dreams about their children, about harvests they would never see, about wives growing old without them. These letters, when they survive in historical records, offer a window into the human cost of imperial ambition that statistics alone cannot convey. The irony, of course, is that much of this suffering was for nothing. The Great Wall, for all its massive scale and the countless lives it consumed, was never particularly effective at keeping out invaders. The Mongols eventually conquered China anyway, as did the Manchus centuries later. The wall was more of a psychological barrier and a symbol of imperial power than an actual military fortification. It was built not because it was needed, but because it could be built, because the emperor had the power to command it and the human resources to accomplish it. Yet somehow, through sheer human endurance and at a cost in blood and tears that we can barely comprehend today, they did it. Mile by grinding mile, stone by stone, life by life, the wall grew across the landscape of northern China. It became, as intended, a monument to imperial power. But it also became something else, a testament to human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale, and perhaps more importantly, a monument to the resilience of ordinary people forced to accomplish the impossible. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, spare a thought for those millions of forgotten workers. They had names, though history has forgotten most of them. They had families who loved them and mourned them. They had dreams and hopes that were crushed under the weight of stone and imperial decree. Their bones rest in the foundation of one of the world's most famous landmarks, and their story deserves to be told, even if it makes for uncomfortable listening. The Great Wall of China stands today as a tourist attraction, a symbol of human achievement, a wonder of the world. But it is also a grave marker, stretching for thousands of miles across the Chinese landscape, marking the final resting place of countless souls who died so that emperors could feel secure and tourists could take photographs. As we continue our journey into this dark chapter of history, we'll explore more of what daily life was like for these workers, the ingenious cruelties of the supervisory system, and the few precious stories of individuals who somehow survived to tell their tales. But for now, let the weight of these first revelations settle like dust on ancient stones. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back across the centuries to those wind-swept mountains where the wall still stands, built on sacrifice, cemented with sorrow, and somehow impossibly still standing after all these years. The morning came too early, as it always did, before the sun painted the eastern mountains with its pale light, before the frost had melted from the stones. The overseers were already moving through the work camps, kicking sleeping men awake with boots that had trampled over too many bodies to count. There was no gentle stirring, no moment to collect your thoughts or remember your dreams. There was only the sharp bark of commands and the knowledge that another day of moving mountains lay ahead. You might wonder how they organized such a massive undertaking, how they managed to coordinate the labor of 1,000,000 men scattered across thousands of miles of frontier. The answer is both impressive in its scope and terrifying in its cold efficiency. The Chinese imperial bureaucracy, even in the 3rd century BCE, was a machine that had been refined over generations to extract maximum productivity from human resources. And you, dear listener, were just another resource to be consumed. The war was divided into sections, each overseen by military commanders who reported directly to the imperial court. Below them were layers of supervisors, foremen, and squad leaders, creating a hierarchy that ensured no worker was ever far from someone ready to punish them for slacking. These weren't benevolent managers concerned with worker welfare. These were men who knew their own heads would roll if their section fell behind schedule, and they passed that desperation down the chain with interest. Each work gang typically consisted of 10 to 20 men, and they were held collectively responsible for meeting their quotas. If one man in your gang couldn't keep up due to illness or injury, the rest of you had to work harder to compensate. If someone in your gang tried to escape, you might all face punishment. This system bred not solidarity among workers, but a grim pragmatism where the weak were abandoned quickly and quietly. Compassion was a luxury that could get you killed. The daily routine was as predictable as it was brutal. You woke in darkness, rolled up your thin sleeping mat, and stumbled to whatever passed for breakfast. If you were lucky, there might be thin porridge made from millet or rice. More often, there was nothing but hot water with a few grains floating in it, what the workers grimly called shadow soup, because you could see your reflection in the bowl. Then came the march to the worksite, often miles from the camp through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. In winter, your breath froze in the air before you could exhale it fully. In summer, the sun began its assault on your body before you'd even picked up your first stone. And the stones, oh, the stones were waiting for you like patient enemies. The actual construction methods varied depending on the terrain and available materials, but the human cost remained constant. In mountainous regions, workers had to quarry stone from living rock using nothing but hammers, chisels, and human determination. The sound of metal on stone rang out from dawn to dusk, a percussion symphony of suffering that echoed off the peaks. Each block had to be shaped by hand, lifted by human backs, and carried to its place in the growing wall. The weight of a single stone block could easily exceed what a strong man could carry alone, so workers developed techniques that distributed the load among several people. Long wooden poles were threaded through rope harnesses, allowing teams of men to carry massive blocks up steep mountainsides. But these techniques came with their own dangers. If one man stumbled, the entire team could be pulled down. If a rope snapped under the strain, blocks could crush whoever was unlucky enough to be beneath them. In flatter regions where stone was scarce, workers made bricks from local clay and fired them in temporary kilns. This might sound easier, but it brought its own special miseries. The clay had to be dug from the earth, mixed with water, and shaped by hand. Workers spent their days bent over, their backs screaming in protest, their hands cracked and bleeding from handling the rough clay. The kilns themselves were death traps, crude furnaces that had to be kept burning at precisely the right temperature. Men tended these fires in conditions that would make modern steelworkers weep, with no protection from the heat and toxic fumes. But perhaps the most soul-crushing work happened in the desert sections, where the wall was built not from stone or brick, but from sand, gravel, and whatever binding agents could be found or created. Here, workers had to construct wooden frames, then fill them with layers of sand mixed with clay, small stones, and sometimes rice paste, or even horseblood as a binding agent. Each layer had to be tamped down by hand, using wooden tools, compacted until it was solid enough to support the next layer. This work required perfect coordination among large teams of men. Some gathered materials, others mixed the binding agents, still others tamped and shaped each section. The pace was relentless because if the work stopped for too long, the partially completed sections could collapse, erasing days or weeks of labor in moments. Workers learned to move like parts of a single machine, each man's rhythm synchronized with his neighbor's, because any disruption in the flow could cascade into disaster. The tools they used were primitive, even by the standards of the time. Hammers and chisels for stonework, but made from inferior metal that dulled quickly and broke often. Wooden carrying poles that splintered under heavy loads. Rope made from plant fibers that rotted in the rain and snapped without warning. When tools broke, and they broke constantly, workers often had to improvise repairs using whatever materials they could scavenge, or sometimes had to work with their bare hands until replacements could be brought from distant supply depots. And then there were the accidents. Construction sites are dangerous even today with modern safety equipment and regulations. Imagine the carnage on a project where human life was considered infinitely replaceable and safety precautions were non-existent. Men fell from scaffolding, were crushed by falling stones, lost limbs to poorly maintained tools, or were simply worn down by the relentless physical demands until their bodies gave out. The records that survive, fragmentary as they are, hint at the scale of workplace injuries. Workers with crushed hands, who could no longer grip tools, but were expected to find other ways to contribute. Men with broken backs, who became camp servants, fetching water and tending fires until they too succumbed to their injuries. Others who lost eyes to stone chips or rope burns, stumbling through their remaining days as a warning to their comrades about the price of momentary inattention. Medical treatment, such as it was, fell to whatever folk remedies the workers could remember from their home villages. Broken bones were splintered with wood and bound with strips torn from clothing. Wounds were packed with mud and herbs in hopes of preventing infection, though infection was often inevitable given the unsanitary conditions. Pain relief came from alcohol when it was available, which wasn't often, or from chewing certain roots and leaves that grew wild in the mountains. The psychological warfare was as systematic as the physical labor. Workers were constantly reminded of their expendability, their worthlessness compared to the grand imperial vision they were serving. Roll calls were held not just to ensure everyone was present, but to read aloud the names of those who had died the previous day, a daily reminder of mortality that ground down even the strongest spirits. Public punishments were designed not just to discipline individual offenders, but to terrorize the entire workforce. A man caught stealing food might be beaten in front of the entire camp, his cries echoing off the mountain walls as a lesson to others. Someone who complained too loudly about working conditions might find himself assigned to the most dangerous tasks, carrying stones up the steepest slopes or working closest to the unstable sections where cave-ins were most likely. But it was the separation from family that may have been the cruelest punishment of all. These weren't professional soldiers or monks who had chosen a life apart from domestic attachments. These were ordinary men who had been ripped away from wives and children, from elderly parents who depended on them, from communities where they had roots going back generations. The loneliness ate at them like acid, dissolving their sense of identity and purpose, until some barely remembered who they had been before they became just another pair of hands moving stones. Letters home, when they were possible, became lifelines to sanity. Workers would spend their few free moments, usually just before exhaustion claimed them each night, composing mental messages to loved ones they might never see again. Some actually managed to send letters through sympathetic merchants or corrupt officials who could be bribed with the workers' meager possessions. These letters, the few that survive in historical records, are heartbreaking in their simplicity and desperate hope. A farmer named Chen writes to his wife about dreaming of their vegetable garden, wondering if she remembered to plant the beans he had prepared before his conscription. A craftsman tells his son to practice his trade, to become so skilled that perhaps he might avoid the fate that had claimed his father. A young man, barely more than a boy, asks his mother to light incense for him at the family shrine, because he fears his spirit might get lost trying to find its way home from these distant mountains. The changing seasons brought their own varieties of suffering, each with its particular torments that the workers learned to dread. Spring meant mudslides as winter snow melted and turned the mountain slopes into treacherous rivers of mud and stone. Work sites that had taken months to prepare could be washed away overnight, and workers who had spent the winter building up their strength on slightly better rations suddenly found themselves starting over from nothing. Summer brought heat that could kill a man in hours if he wasn't careful. The sun reflected off the stonework with blinding intensity, and workers learned to recognize the signs of heat sickness in themselves and others, the dizzy spells and confusion that preceded collapse. Water became more precious than food, and fights would break out over access to the few springs and streams near work sites. Some men died simply from drinking too much water too quickly after days of deprivation, their bodies unable to handle the sudden influx. Autumn was the season of desperation, when work crews raced to complete as much construction as possible, before winter made further progress impossible. The pace became even more frantic, and exhausted men pushed beyond their limits made more mistakes, leading to more accidents and deaths. There was also the psychological weight of knowing that winter was coming, that the already marginal conditions were about to become truly life-threatening. But winter was when the Great Wall became truly murderous. Temperatures in the northern mountains could drop so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Tools became so cold they would burn your hands if you touched them with bare skin. The stone itself became brittle and dangerous to work with, shattering unexpectedly and sending sharp fragments flying like shrapnel. Workers huddled together in whatever shelter they could construct from scraps of wood and cloth, sharing body heat and hoping to survive until dawn. Many didn't. They would freeze to death in their sleep, and their surviving comrades would face the grim task of deciding whether to waste precious energy burying them or to simply build their bodies into the wall along with the stones. More often than not, pragmatism won, and the wall grew not just with stone and mortar, but with the frozen corpses of men who had died building it. The supply lines that kept the work camps barely functioning became even more precarious in winter. Convoys of supplies might be snowed in for weeks, leaving work sites completely cut off from the outside world. Workers survived on whatever they had managed to store, supplemented by anything edible they could find in the frozen landscape. Tree bark, roots, leather from worn-out shoes, anything that could provide a few calories to keep them alive until spring. And through it all, the work continued. Even when men were dying of cold and starvation, even when tools shattered in the freezing air, even when the wind howled across the mountains with such force that it knocked workers off their feet, the wall had to grow. Because somewhere far to the south, in the warm palaces of the capital, an emperor had decreed that it would be so. The sheer scale of human organization required for such a project staggers the imagination. Supply chains stretching hundreds of miles, coordinating the movement of materials and men across terrain that would challenge modern logistics. Communication networks that could relay orders and information across vast distances, using nothing but human messengers on foot or horseback. Administrative systems that could track the deployment of 1 million workers while ensuring that taxes continued to be collected from the villages they had been taken from. But all of this impressive bureaucratic machinery was ultimately powered by human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. Every stone in the wall represents not just a triumph of engineering, but a small tragedy of human endurance pushed beyond its breaking point. Every mile of the wall's length marks the graves of men whose names were never recorded, whose families never learned their fate, whose sacrifice was forgotten as soon as the section they died building was complete. The guards didn't sleep, but the workers wished they did. Through the long mountain nights, overseers patrolled the camps with torches, their shadows dancing across the faces of exhausted men who had collapsed wherever they could find space to lie down. These weren't security patrols in any conventional sense. The workers had nowhere to run, no energy to cause trouble, and certainly no weapons to rebel with. No, these night watches served a different purpose entirely. They were reminders that even in sleep, even in the brief escape that unconsciousness offered from the daily hell of construction, you were still being watched. Sleep itself became a luxury rationed as carefully as food. Workers were allowed perhaps 4 or 5 hours of rest, if they were fortunate enough to find a spot sheltered from the wind. But sleep in those conditions wasn't the restorative rest that a body needs to recover from brutal physical labor. It was more like a brief cessation of suffering, a temporary pause in consciousness that left you feeling more exhausted upon waking than you had been when you finally collapsed. The sleeping arrangements, if they could be called that, varied depending on the season and location, but they were universally miserable. In summer, men slept on bare ground under the open sky, with nothing but thin cloth to protect them from insects that swarmed up from the valleys below. These weren't ordinary mosquitoes or flies, but mountain creatures that seemed specifically designed to make human life unbearable. They would crawl into your ears, your nose, bite any exposed skin until you were covered in welts that became infected in the unsanitary conditions of the camp. Winter sleeping was a different kind of nightmare. Workers would dig shallow pits in the frozen earth, then huddle together like animals, sharing whatever scraps of cloth or fur they had managed to salvage or steal. The unlucky ones on the edges of these human piles would sometimes freeze to death during the night, their bodies becoming rigid barriers between the living and the howling wind. By morning, the survivors would have to pry themselves away from the frozen corpses of their bunkmates, a daily ritual that hardened hearts and broke spirits in equal measure. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of life on the wall wasn't the physical hardship, crushing as that was. It was the complete absence of any meaningful human connection. These men had been transformed from individuals with names, families, and personal histories into interchangeable units of labor. The overseers didn't bother learning their names. Fellow workers, consumed by their own struggle to survive, couldn't afford to form attachments that would only make the inevitable losses more painful. The dehumanization was systematic and thorough. Workers were identified by the section they worked on and their position within their gang. Section 12, Gang 4, Position 7, wasn't just a bureaucratic designation, it was often the only identity a man retained after months or years on the wall. Personal belongings were lost, stolen, or worn to nothing. The clothes they wore became indistinguishable rags that barely covered their increasingly skeletal frames. Their faces, weathered by wind and sun and marked by malnutrition, began to look eerily similar, as if the wall was slowly erasing their individual humanity along with their strength. Communication between workers became a strange, truncated thing. Men who might once have been poets or storytellers found themselves reduced to grunts and gestures, conserving their energy for the essential business of moving stones. Conversations, when they happened at all, focused on the immediate and practical. Where to find water, how to avoid the attention of particularly brutal overseers, rumors about which sections were experiencing higher mortality rates. Dreams, hopes, memories of home became too painful to discuss, too dangerous to dwell upon. The food situation, already desperate, became a source of constant psychological torment, as much as physical suffering. The daily ration, when it arrived at all, was barely enough to keep a man alive, much less provide the nutrition needed for heavy construction work. But it wasn't just the quantity that was devastating. It was the quality, or complete lack thereof. What passed for food would have been rejected by animals in better times. Grain that had rotted in storage, mixed with sand and debris to increase its weight. Meat that was more maggot than flesh, if you were fortunate enough to receive any protein at all. vegetables that had fermented in their own decay, producing a sour stench that could make you gag even when you were desperate enough to eat anything. Workers developed a grim hierarchy around food procurement. Those with the strength to work faster might receive slightly larger portions. Those who could curry favor with guards might occasionally receive scraps from the overseer's meals. But most learned to supplement their meager rations with anything remotely edible they could find in the landscape around the construction sites. They chewed bark stripped from trees, if any trees grew in the barren regions where they worked. They dug for roots in the frozen ground, often with their bare hands when tools weren't available. They caught insects, small rodents, anything that moved and might provide a few calories. Some sections of the wall were built near enough to streams or lakes that workers could sometimes catch fish or collect water plants. But these were considered prime assignments, and the competition for such positions was fierce and often violent. The worst posts were in the high mountain deserts, where nothing grew, and water was so scarce that men would fight over the privilege of licking moisture from rocks in the early morning. In these locations, workers learned to eat things that would have horrified them in their former lives. Leather from worn-out equipment, boiled until it became a glutinous paste, their own fingernails and hair, anything that might provide some trace of nutrition to bodies that were slowly consuming themselves. Cannibalism, though never officially acknowledged in any surviving records, almost certainly occurred in the most desperate situations. When men were starving and surrounded by the bodies of their dead comrades, when the alternative was their own death, some crossed that final line. The shame of such acts was another burden that survivors carried, another layer of trauma that ensured even those who eventually returned home would never truly escape the wall. The corruption that permeated every level of the construction hierarchy made an already impossible situation even worse. Guards who were supposed to distribute rations fairly would sell the best food to workers who could pay, leaving nothing but scraps for those with no resources to trade. Supervisors would demand bribes for assignments to less dangerous work details. Even water, the most basic necessity of life, became a commodity to be bought and sold. Workers quickly learned that their few possessions, meager as they were, could mean the difference between life and death if traded at the right moment. A good knife might buy you a week of slightly larger food portions. A warm piece of clothing could be exchanged for assignment to indoor work during the worst winter storms. But these transactions came with their own risks. Be caught trading with the wrong person, or be unable to pay what you had promised, and the consequences could be swift and brutal. The medical situation was perhaps even more nightmarish than the food crisis. Injuries were inevitable when men weakened by malnutrition were forced to perform dangerous work with primitive tools. But there was no medical corps, no hospitals, barely even folk remedies available to treat the constant stream of broken bones, crushed limbs, and infected wounds that plagued the workforce. Workers developed their own crude methods of treating injuries. Knowledge passed down from the more experienced men who had somehow survived multiple seasons on the wall. Broken bones were splintered with whatever wood could be found and bound with strips torn from clothing. Wounds were packed with mud and moss in hopes of stopping bleeding, though infection was almost inevitable in the filthy conditions of the camps. Pain relief came from alcohol when it could be obtained, which was rarely, or from chewing certain mountain plants that some workers had learned could dull sensation. But mostly men simply endured agony that would have sent them screaming to physicians in their former lives. They worked with broken ribs, infected cuts, twisted ankles, and countless other injuries that never had the chance to heal properly. The psychological toll of watching fellow workers suffer and die without any medical intervention was immense. Men learned to recognize the signs that a comrade was beyond help, the particular look in the eyes that meant death was approaching. They learned to harden their hearts to the groans and pleas of the injured, because compassion was a luxury that could distract you from your own survival. Some workers tried to help their injured comrades, sharing their meager food or water, trying to protect them from the worst assignments. But such kindness often meant condemning yourself to the same fate. The strong survived, if they survived at all, by learning to step over the weak. The wall demanded not just physical strength, but a kind of moral numbness that allowed men to continue functioning while surrounded by preventable suffering. Disease spread through the work camps like wildfire, aided by malnutrition, poor sanitation, and the close quarters in which men were forced to live. Dysentery, pneumonia, typhus, and countless other ailments swept through sections of workers, sometimes killing more men than accidents or violence. Quarantine was impossible given the work demands, so sick men continued to labor alongside healthy ones until they collapsed or died. The bodies of the dead presented their own logistical nightmare. In warmer months, corpses decomposed quickly, creating health hazards and attracting scavengers. In winter, they froze solid and had to be stacked like cordwood until they could be disposed of. But disposal itself was a problem. The ground was often too hard to dig graves, and there was rarely time or energy to carry bodies far from the work sites. The solution, as grimly practical as everything else about the wall's construction, was to incorporate the dead into the structure itself. Bodies were placed in the foundations covered with stones and mortar, and became permanent parts of the fortification. This wasn't done with any ceremony or respect for the deceased. It was simply the most efficient way to deal with the constant stream of mortality that the project generated. Workers learned to think of death not as a tragedy, but as a form of release. Men who were clearly dying would sometimes be envied by their healthier comrades, who faced the prospect of years more suffering before their own inevitable end. The phrase, "joining the wall," became common parlance for death, spoken without emotion or grief, just another fact of daily life on the construction sites. And still, somehow, impossibly, the work continued. Stone by stone, section by section, death by death, the Great Wall grew across the landscape of northern China. Not because the workers believed in the project, not because they were inspired by imperial propaganda, but because stopping meant immediate execution and continuing meant the slim possibility of surviving another day. The wall rose from human suffering as much as from stone and mortar, a monument not to Chinese engineering prowess, but to the capacity of ordinary people to endure the unendurable when they have no other choice. Every brick was mortared with tears. Every foundation stone was set upon the bones of men who had died placing it there. The irony wasn't lost on the few workers who lived long enough to contemplate it. Here they were, building what was supposed to be the ultimate defense against barbarian invasions, and yet they themselves were being treated worse than any enemy army ever could. The northern nomads that the wall was meant to keep out at least had their freedom, their horses, their families. The men building the barrier had nothing but the stones that slowly crushed their spirits along with their bodies. But let's talk about what it actually meant to move those stones, because the romanticized image of noble workers constructing a great monument dissolves quickly when you understand the brutal physics of the operation. A single stone block used in the wall's construction could weigh anywhere from 50 to several hundred pounds. Now imagine you're a man who's been subsisting on watery gruel for months, whose muscles have wasted away until your ribs show through skin that's been burned black by mountain sun and wind. Imagine trying to lift, carry, and precisely place these blocks while your hands shake from malnutrition and your vision blurs from exhaustion. The techniques they developed weren't elegant engineering solutions. They were desperate improvisations born from the collision between impossible demands and human limitations. Teams of workers would wrap rough ropes around blocks, then strain together to drag them up slopes that would challenge a pack animal. The ropes, made from whatever plant fibers could be found or scavenged, cut into shoulders and hands until workers' bodies were crisscrossed with permanent scars from the constant friction. When the slope was too steep for dragging, they built crude ramps from smaller stones and earth. Back-breaking projects in themselves that could take days or weeks to complete. Workers would spend their lives building these temporary structures just so they could move a single large block into position, then tear down the ramps and build new ones for the next stone. It was construction built upon construction, suffering layered upon suffering, with each small task requiring its own monumental effort. The precision required was maddening. These weren't rough stone walls where gaps could be filled with mortar and forgotten. The wall had to meet exact specifications, with blocks fitted together so tightly that a knife blade couldn't slip between them. This meant that stones quarried in rough mountain conditions had to be shaped and finished by hand, using tools that were primitive, even by ancient standards. Workers spent countless hours with hammers and chisels, slowly pecking away at granite and limestone, until their hands were destroyed by the constant vibration, and their ears rang permanently from the endless percussion of metal on stone. The dust from this work coated everything, filling lungs and causing respiratory diseases that killed men slowly over months or years. Many workers developed a distinctive cough, a harsh rasping sound that became as much a part of the wall's construction as the ring of hammers. And then there was the mortar, that crucial binding agent that held the massive structure together. In different regions, workers had to create this mortar from whatever materials were available locally. Sometimes it was lime mixed with sand and water, a relatively straightforward process if you ignored the fact that creating lime required burning limestone at extremely high temperatures using primitive kilns that were constantly exploding and killing their operators. In other regions, workers discovered that rice paste, mixed with crushed stone and clay, created a surprisingly durable mortar. But this meant that precious food was being diverted from human consumption to construction, another cruel irony that wasn't lost on men who were slowly starving. They would spend their days mixing rice that they desperately wanted to eat into mortar that would outlast their own lives by centuries. Some sections of the wall used even more exotic binding agents. Horseblood, when it could be obtained, created a mortar that was remarkably strong and weather-resistant. But horses were valuable animals, and their blood was expensive. Workers sometimes used their own blood when they had no other options, opening veins and mixing their life essence directly into the mortar. The wall, quite literally, contains the blood of the men who built it. The seasonal rhythms of construction created their own particular torments. Spring brought hope, but also floods, as winter snow melted and turned construction sites into muddy quagmires. Work that had taken months to complete could be washed away in a single night of heavy rain. Workers would arrive at their sites to find foundations they had laid stone by stone scattered across valleys below, and they would have to begin again with no additional time allocated for the setback. Summer work was a race against dehydration. The sun reflecting off the stone surfaces created temperatures that could kill a man in hours. Workers learned to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion in themselves and others. But knowledge didn't equal prevention when water was scarce and shade was non-existent. Men would collapse mid-task, their tools clattering to the ground as they fell unconscious from the heat. The lucky ones were revived with precious water and given a few minutes to recover in whatever shade could be found. The unlucky ones died where they fell, their bodies left beside the work sites as warnings to others about the importance of pacing themselves. But pacing was a luxury when quotas had to be met and overseers were watching for any sign of deliberate slowdown. Autumn brought its own desperation as work crews raced to complete as much construction as possible before winter made further progress impossible. The pace became even more frantic, and exhausted men pushed beyond their limits, made more mistakes, leading to more accidents and deaths. Tools broke more frequently under the increased pace, and replacement tools were slow to arrive from distant supply centers. Workers learned to improvise with whatever materials they could find, fashioning crude hammers from stones tied to wooden handles, making chisels from sharpened pieces of scrap metal. These improvised tools were less effective and more dangerous than proper equipment, but they were better than working with bare hands, which some men were eventually reduced to doing. But it was winter that truly revealed the murderous nature of the wall project. Temperatures in the northern mountains could drop so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Tools became so cold they would burn your hands if you touched them with bare skin. But workers couldn't afford gloves even if they had been available. They wrapped their hands in strips of cloth torn from their clothing, but these makeshift protections wore through quickly and provided little insulation against the bitter cold. The stone itself became brittle and dangerous to work with in extreme cold, shattering unexpectedly and sending sharp fragments flying like shrapnel. Workers learned to approach their tasks differently in winter, moving more slowly and carefully, but this caution conflicted with the constant pressure to maintain construction schedules regardless of weather conditions. Water for mixing mortar would freeze in the containers before it could be used, requiring workers to keep fires burning constantly just to maintain liquid water for construction. But fuel for these fires was scarce in the barren mountain regions, where much of the wall was built. Workers burned whatever they could find: scraps of wood, dried grass, even their own clothing when nothing else was available. The fires themselves became centers of desperate competition. Men would fight for positions close to the warmth, and those on the outer edges of the circles would slowly freeze while their luckier comrades warmed themselves. Some workers froze to death while standing upright, leaning on their tools, and weren't discovered until morning when work resumed. Food preparation became nearly impossible in winter conditions. The thin gruel that sustained the workers would freeze solid in their bowls before they could finish eating it. Men learned to eat as quickly as possible, gulping down their rations while the food was still warm, often burning their mouths and throats in their haste to consume calories before the meal became inedible ice. Sleep in winter was more like a series of brief, unconscious periods, interrupted by the need to move to prevent freezing. Workers would huddle together in whatever shelter they could construct. But these arrangements were hierarchical. The strongest men claimed positions in the center of the human piles, while the weakest were relegated to the outer edges where they were most likely to freeze to death during the night. Morning roll calls in winter became grim censuses of survival. Overseers would move through the camps, kicking sleeping figures to determine who was still alive and who had frozen to death during the night. The dead were dragged away to be incorporated into the day's construction, while the living were expected to begin another day of work, regardless of how many of their comrades had perished in the darkness. The psychological impact of these winter deaths was devastating. Workers would wake up pressed against the frozen corpses of men they had known, had shared food with, had worked beside for months or years. The intimacy of these death scenes, the way cold bodies became rigid barriers between the living and the wind, created a kind of trauma that survivors carried with them long after they left the wall, and yet, impossibly, the work continued. Even when men were dying of cold and starvation, even when tools shattered in the freezing air, even when the wind howled across the mountains with such force that it knocked workers off their feet, stones continued to be placed, mortar continued to be mixed, and the wall continued to grow. Because somewhere far to the south, in warm palaces where fires burned in marble hearths and silk-robed officials sipped hot tea, the emperor had decreed that it would be so. The supply lines that kept this massive project functioning were themselves marvels of brutal efficiency. Imagine the logistics of feeding, clothing, and equipping 1 million workers scattered across thousands of miles of frontier territory. Every grain of rice, every iron tool, every scrap of cloth had to be produced somewhere else and transported by human labor across terrain that challenged even experienced traders. Long convoys of supply workers, men almost as unfortunate as the construction crews themselves, formed human chains stretching back towards civilization. They carried impossible loads on their backs, pushing handcarts over rocky paths, driving pack animals loaded with materials until the beasts collapsed from exhaustion. These supply workers had their own mortality rates, their own catalogue of suffering, as they struggled to keep the wall project fed and equipped. The irony was that the wall consumed resources at such a rate that entire regions of China were stripped bare to support its construction. Forests were clear-cut to provide timber for scaffolding and tools. Iron mines were worked to exhaustion producing hammers, chisels, and other equipment that broke constantly under the harsh conditions. Agricultural regions were taxed so heavily to feed the workers that local populations faced their own famines. China, in building its great defensive barrier, was systematically weakening itself in every other way. The human resources devoted to the wall could have been used to improve agriculture, develop new technologies, or strengthen the economy. Instead, they were consumed in a project that, for all its massive scale, never actually succeeded in keeping out the very invaders it was designed to stop. But such strategic considerations were far from the minds of the workers who had to live and die with the daily reality of construction. For them, the wall wasn't a grand imperial vision or a monument to Chinese civilization. It was simply the thing that was killing them, slowly and systematically, one stone at a time. The stories that survive, fragmentary as they are, give us glimpses into the human cost of this monumental project. A merchant's account mentions passing a section of the wall where the workers were so weakened by hunger that they could barely lift their tools. A court official's diary records his shock at seeing construction sites littered with human bones. A folk song, passed down through generations, tells of wives waiting for husbands who will never return from the northern mountains. These scattered pieces of evidence, combined with what we know about the scale and duration of the project, paint a picture of suffering that staggers the imagination. The Great Wall of China stands today as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements, but it is also one of history's greatest monuments to human cruelty and waste. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, perhaps you can spare a thought for those millions of forgotten workers whose bones rest in the foundations of the wall. They had names, though history remembers few of them. They had families who loved them and mourned their absence. They had hopes and dreams that were ground to dust under the weight of imperial ambition. Their sacrifice was not voluntary, and it was not noble. It was simply the price that ordinary people paid, so that emperors could feel secure, and so that tourists, centuries later, could walk along stone pathways and marvel at human achievement. The wall endures, but so should the memory of what it truly cost to build. The administration of death became as systematized as everything else about the wall project. When a worker died, whether from exhaustion, injury, or disease, there was a brief but efficient process that followed. The body was searched for anything useful: tools, scraps of food, pieces of clothing that might serve another worker better than they served a corpse. Personal effects, if any remained, were sometimes set aside to be sent back to families, though more often they simply disappeared into the possessions of supervisors or guards. What happened next depended on the season, the location, and the immediate needs of the construction project. In winter, when the ground was frozen solid and digging graves was nearly impossible, bodies were often simply stacked like cordwood in designated areas near the work sites. These makeshift morgues became grim landmarks, growing larger as the cold months wore on, shrinking only when spring thaws allowed for mass burials, or when the accumulated corpses were incorporated into the wall's foundation. In warmer months, the disposal of bodies became more urgent as decomposition created health hazards for the living workers. But even then, proper burial was a luxury that few could afford in terms of time or energy. The most common solution was to place bodies in the foundations of new wall sections, covering them with stones and mortar as just another building material. Archaeological evidence from various sections of the wall supports these grim accounts, with human remains found integrated into the structure itself. The psychological impact of working alongside and literally building upon the bodies of dead comrades cannot be overstated. Workers learned to step over corpses as they went about their daily tasks, to sleep next to the bodies of men who had died during the night, to continue construction while the smell of death permeated everything around them. This constant proximity to mortality created a kind of emotional numbness that was perhaps necessary for survival, but came at the cost of basic human empathy. Some workers developed rituals to cope with the omnipresence of death. They would whisper the names of dead comrades as they placed stones, creating informal memorials that would be buried forever in the wall's structure. Others would take small personal items from the deceased, not from greed, but as a way of maintaining some connection to the humanity that was being systematically stripped away from all of them. The guards and overseers who managed this human catastrophe developed their own methods of psychological protection. Many became genuinely cruel, finding in sadism a way to distance themselves from the suffering they were administering. Others retreated into rigid bureaucracy, treating the workers as nothing more than inventory to be managed and consumed. A few, according to scattered historical accounts, went mad from the weight of what they were witnessing and participating in. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the wall's construction was how quickly it all became normalized. What should have been shocking, the casual disposal of human life on an industrial scale, became routine administrative procedure. Workers learned not to form attachments to their comrades because loss was inevitable and grief was a luxury that could interfere with survival. Guards learned to see deaths not as tragedies, but as simple logistics problems to be solved efficiently. The few records kept by administrators focused on productivity metrics rather than human welfare. Reports to the imperial court detailed how many li of wall had been completed, how much stone had been quarried, how many workers had been deployed to different sections. Mortality rates, when mentioned at all, were presented as acceptable losses in service of the greater imperial vision. This bureaucratic dehumanization extended even to the language used to describe the workers and their fates. Men weren't injured or killed, they were rendered unproductive or removed from active duty. Death wasn't a tragedy, it was a resource depletion that required replacement personnel to be requisitioned from distant provinces. The very words used to describe human suffering were designed to strip away any emotional resonance that might interfere with the cold efficiency of the project. The communication systems that held this vast project together were themselves marvels of organization built on human misery. Messages traveled along the wall's route carried by relay runners who faced their own catalogue of dangers and hardships. These messengers, often young men chosen for their speed and endurance, would run sections of dozens of miles carrying orders, reports, and requests for supplies or personnel. The relay stations where these runners rested and passed their messages to the next carrier became small nodes of information in an otherwise isolated world. Here, workers might occasionally learn news from other sections of the wall, though such news was usually grim. Reports of cave-ins that had killed entire work gangs, disease outbreaks that had decimated construction crews, or harsh winters that had frozen workers solid at their posts. These stations also served as collection points for the few letters that workers managed to send home, though the postal system, such as it was unreliable and often corrupt. Messages might take months to travel even short distances, and many never reached their destinations at all. Guards would sometimes demand bribes to carry letters or simply discard them when the task became inconvenient. For many workers, the act of writing a letter home became more important than whether it was actually delivered, a way of maintaining the illusion that they were still connected to the world they had been torn from. The seasonal migrations of birds became a source of both hope and torment for the workers. Seeing flocks heading south in autumn reminded them of home, of harvests they would never participate in, of families gathering for festivals they would never attend again. Spring migrations brought their own anguish, as workers realized they had survived another winter but faced another year of imprisonment on the wall. Some workers developed an almost mystical relationship with these migrating birds, seeing in their freedom a reminder of what had been taken from them. There are accounts of men standing motionless for long periods, watching flocks pass overhead, tears streaming down faces that had been hardened by months or years of suffering. Others would try to send messages home by tying scraps of cloth to the legs of captured birds, though whether any of these desperate communications ever reached their intended recipients is unknown. The changing of the seasons also brought different types of work and different varieties of suffering. Spring construction focused on repairing winter damage, replacing stones that had cracked from frost, rebuilding sections that had been damaged by ice and snow. This might sound like easier work, but it came with its own challenges. Workers weakened by winter malnutrition struggled to perform even basic tasks, and the wet conditions of spring thaws made everything more difficult and dangerous. Summer brought the most intensive construction periods, when the weather allowed for the most ambitious building projects. This was when new sections of wall were begun, when the most dangerous quarrying operations took place, when workers died in the greatest numbers from heat exhaustion and accidents. The pace during these months was relentless, with work continuing from before dawn until well after sunset, making use of every available hour of daylight. Autumn was a season of desperate urgency, as work crews raced to complete as much construction as possible before winter weather made further progress impossible. The pressure during these months was enormous, with quotas that reflected not realistic expectations of human capacity, but the arbitrary demands of distant administrators who had never wielded a hammer or carried a stone. The geographic variations in construction methods and materials created different types of hardship for workers in different regions. Those assigned to mountain sections faced the dangers of working at high altitudes on unstable terrain, where a single misstep could send a man plummeting to his death. Desert workers battled extreme temperatures, water scarcity, and sandstorms that could bury entire construction sites overnight. In some regions, workers had to adapt to local materials that presented unique challenges. Sections built from packed earth required different techniques from those constructed with quarried stone, but the human cost remained constant. Workers in earthwall regions spent their days digging, carrying, and compacting soil in a process that was perhaps less dramatic than stone construction, but equally exhausting and deadly. The tools used in different regions varied according to available materials and local traditions, but all shared certain characteristics. They were primitive, poorly made, and constantly breaking under the strain of heavy use. Workers became skilled at improvising repairs and creating makeshift tools from whatever materials they could scavenge. But these improvised implements were even more dangerous and less effective than the inadequate official equipment. Quality control on tool production was virtually non-existent, with manufacturers focused on meeting quantity quotas rather than creating durable equipment. Hammers would shatter after a few days of use, sending metal fragments flying into workers' faces. Chisels would dull so quickly that workers spent more time trying to resharpen them than actually cutting stone. Ropes would snap under loads they were supposedly designed to carry, often with fatal results for the workers depending on them. The economic impact of the war's construction rippled through Chinese society in ways that affected millions of people who never came close to the northern frontier. Villages that lost their adult men to conscription struggled to maintain agricultural production, leading to local famines and economic collapse. Regions that were heavily taxed to support the war project faced their own hardships as resources were extracted to feed the insatiable demands of construction. Entire industries developed around supplying the wall project, from iron mines that produced tools to farms that grew food specifically for worker rations. But these industries were themselves built on exploitation and suffering, with workers in mines and fields facing their own versions of the hardships endured by wall construction crews. The social fabric of Chinese society was torn and rewoven around the demands of wall construction. Families were broken apart not just by conscription, but by the economic pressures that forced people to abandon their traditional ways of life to serve the project in various capacities. Women left without husbands struggled to maintain households and raise children alone. Elderly parents lost the sons who would have cared for them in their old age. Communities that had existed for generations were sometimes completely depopulated as their adult men were marched away to work on the wall. Villages became ghost towns, inhabited only by women, children, and the elderly, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of normal life, while the foundation of their society had been ripped away. The cultural impact was equally profound. Traditional festivals and ceremonies that required the participation of entire communities became impossible to maintain when the communities themselves had been scattered. Folk traditions that had been passed down from father to son were lost when the fathers died on the wall, and the sons never returned home to carry on the customs. Oral histories, songs, and stories that had preserved local identity and cultural memory for centuries began to disappear as the people who carried them were consumed by the wall project. Entire dialects and regional customs vanished as communities were destroyed and their members dispersed or killed. The war project became a kind of cultural black hole, absorbing not just human lives but the traditions, knowledge, and social structures that those lives had supported. In building their great barrier against external threats, the Chinese emperors were systematically destroying the internal cultural fabric that made their civilization worth defending. Religious practices were disrupted as temples lost their congregations and priests found their communities scattered to the winds. Ancestor worship, a cornerstone of Chinese spiritual life, became almost impossible to maintain when families were separated and family graves were left untended. The very concept of filial piety, so central to Chinese ethics, was undermined by a government policy that separated sons from parents and husbands from wives for years at a time. Even the imperial court began to feel the effects of the massive resource drain that the wall represented. Tax revenues declined as the economic base that supported them was systematically weakened. Military strength was paradoxically reduced by a defensive project that consumed so many potential soldiers in construction work that fewer were available for actual military service. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, though few dared to voice their criticisms openly. China was weakening itself in every measurable way in order to build a defensive barrier that, as history would prove, was largely ineffective at keeping out determined invaders. The wall was a monument to imperial ego rather than strategic necessity, built at a cost that no rational calculation could justify. But rational calculation was not the driving force behind the wall project. It was built because emperors could build it, because they had the power to command it and the human resources to accomplish it. The suffering of the workers was not an unfortunate side effect of construction. It was an integral part of the project's purpose. The wall was meant to demonstrate imperial power, not just to external enemies, but to internal subjects, to show that the emperor could command the movement of mountains and the sacrifice of millions of lives. In this sense, the wall succeeded perfectly. It demonstrated that the Chinese emperor could indeed command resources on a scale that defied comprehension, could organize human labor in ways that achieved the impossible, could build monuments that would endure for millennia. The fact that this achievement required the destruction of countless human lives was not a flaw in the system. It was proof of the system's ultimate power. The workers who died building the wall were not victims of some tragic accident or unforeseen disaster. They were sacrifices offered on the altar of imperial ambition, human offerings made to the god of state power. Their deaths were not mourned because they were not intended to be mourned. They were intended to be forgotten, to disappear into the stone and mortar of the wall itself, leaving behind only the monument to the power that had consumed them. And for the most part, this intended forgetting was successful. The wall endures as a tourist attraction and symbol of Chinese civilization, while the names and stories of the men who built it have been lost to history. We remember the emperors who commanded its construction, but not the workers who died building it. We celebrate the engineering achievement while ignoring the human cost. This forgetting was not accidental. It was part of the design of imperial power, which required that individual human suffering be rendered invisible and meaningless compared to the glory of state achievement. The wall stands as a monument not just to Chinese engineering capabilities, but to the capacity of state power to transform human beings into raw materials for its grand projects. As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, perhaps you can hold space in your thoughts for those forgotten workers, the millions whose names were never recorded, whose families never learned their fate, whose bones became part of the foundation of one of the world's most famous landmarks. They were not heroes or volunteers or willing participants in some great national project. They were ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen and labourers who were ground up in the machinery of imperial ambition and whose suffering has been erased from the official story of their own sacrifice. The wall still stands, winding across the mountains of northern China like a stone dragon sleeping in the sun. But it is not just a wall of stone and mortar. It is a wall built from human bones, cemented with human blood, and maintained by human memory. Every tourist who walks along its ramparts walks over the graves of the men who died building it. Every photograph taken of its sweeping vistas captures not just a landscape, but a cemetery stretching for thousands of miles. The Great Wall of China is indeed one of the wonders of the world, but it is a wonder built on suffering so vast and systematic that the mind struggles to comprehend it. It stands as a testament to human achievement, yes, but also as a warning about the price of unchecked power and the cost of treating human beings as expendable resources in service of grand visions. The morning brought with it not just the familiar ache of exhaustion, but something else entirely. A different kind of dread that settled in the stomach like cold stone. Because today wasn't just another day of moving rocks and mixing mortar. Today was the day they brought in the new workers. You could always tell when fresh conscripts were arriving. The camps would buzz with a strange energy, part anticipation, part cruel amusement. The veterans, those who had somehow survived months or years on the wall, would gather to watch the newcomers stumble off the transport lines. It wasn't kindness that drew them to these arrival scenes. It was the bitter satisfaction of seeing their own past suffering reflected in fresh faces that still held hope. The new arrivals were easy to spot. They still had meat on their bones, still moved with the confident stride of men who expected to return home someday. Their tools were shiny and new, their clothes relatively clean, their eyes bright with the kind of optimism that the wall would crush within weeks. They looked around at the construction sites with something approaching curiosity rather than the dead-eyed resignation of the long-term workers. But perhaps most tellingly, they still spoke to each other. They asked questions, shared stories from their home villages, wondered aloud about when they might see their families again. The veteran workers watched this chatter with something between pity and contempt, because they remembered when they too had believed that words still mattered, that human connection could survive in this place. The integration process was brutal in its efficiency. New workers were assigned to gangs led by veterans, not out of any mentoring instinct, but because experienced workers knew how to extract maximum productivity from fresh bodies before they broke down. The newcomers would be given the heaviest stones to carry, the most dangerous positions on scaffolding, the tasks that required the most energy, while the veterans conserved their strength for the long haul. It wasn't personal cruelty exactly, it was survival mathematics. Every gang had quotas to meet, and a gang that fell behind faced collective punishment. Better to burn out the new workers quickly while they still had strength than to coddle them and risk everyone's punishment when productivity dropped. The wall had a way of turning even basic human decency into a luxury that could get you killed. The newcomers would protest at first. They would appeal to fairness, argue about equitable distribution of labour, cite whatever local customs or moral codes they brought from their home communities. The veteran workers would listen to these protests with the patient expression of men watching children discover that fire burns. because they remembered making the same arguments, believing in the same concepts of justice that had no meaning here. Within a week or two, the new workers' voices would grow quieter. Within a month, they would stop speaking unnecessarily altogether. By the time they had survived their first winter, if they survived it, they would be watching the next group of newcomers with the same mixture of pity and contempt they had once received. The cycle was as reliable as the seasons, as predictable as sunrise. The supervisors understood this psychological progression and used it to their advantage. They would deliberately pair new workers with the most broken veterans, men whose spirits had been so thoroughly crushed that they had become extensions of the supervisory apparatus itself. These hollow-eyed guides would explain the rules with the mechanical precision of men reciting a catechism they no longer believed but dared not question. You work until you're told to stop. You eat what you're given when you're given it. You sleep where you're assigned. You don't ask questions about home. You don't make plans for after. You don't help anyone who can't help themselves. You don't waste energy on hope. The litany would be delivered in the flat monotone of absolute defeat, and the new workers would listen with growing horror as they realized they were hearing their own future being described. But the most insidious part of the integration process was how quickly new workers learned to compete with each other rather than cooperate. The wall's management systems were designed to turn solidarity into a liability. Workers who helped struggling comrades found themselves falling behind on their own quotas. Those who shared food faced starvation themselves. Men who showed mercy discovered that mercy was a resource they couldn't afford to waste. The new arrivals would start their service believing that cooperation was not just morally right, but practically necessary. Surely, they reasoned, working together would make everyone more effective, more likely to survive. But the wall's quotas and punishment systems made cooperation actively dangerous. Help someone else, and you might doom yourself. Fail to meet your individual targets because you were assisting others, and you would face consequences that could easily prove fatal. This deliberate cultivation of selfishness served multiple purposes for the wall's administrators. It prevented the formation of worker solidarity that might lead to organized resistance. It ensured that workers would police each other's productivity rather than requiring additional supervisors. And perhaps most cruelly, it forced decent men to abandon their moral principles, creating a kind of spiritual death that accompanied the physical deterioration. The veterans would watch new workers struggle with these moral compromises, remembering their own journey from human decency to survival pragmatism. They had once agonized over the same choices, wrestled with the same ethical dilemmas, felt the same shame at abandoning comrades who couldn't keep up. But that internal struggle had been worn away by months or years of impossible decisions, until they no longer felt the weight of choices that would once have tormented them. This moral numbing was perhaps the wall's most devastating achievement. It didn't just kill workers' bodies, it killed their capacity for empathy, their ability to see suffering as something that demanded response, rather than something to be ignored for the sake of personal survival. Men who had once been beloved fathers and sons became hollow shells who could step over dying comrades without feeling anything more than mild annoyance at the obstacle in their path. The psychological techniques used to break down new workers were as systematic as the physical labor demands. Supervisors would deliberately create situations where workers had to choose between personal survival and helping others. They would distribute food unevenly, forcing workers to decide whether to share their meager rations or hoard them for themselves. They would assign impossible tasks to some workers while giving others slightly more manageable loads, creating resentment and competition within work gangs. These weren't accidental management failures or the result of incompetent administration. They were deliberate strategies designed to prevent the formation of worker solidarity that might threaten the project's continuation. The wall's supervisors understood that desperate men might rebel if they maintained their capacity for collective action. But men who had been turned against each other, who saw their fellow workers as competitors rather than allies, would focus their energy on individual survival rather than group resistance. The new workers would arrive with stories from their home villages, memories of community celebrations, tales of neighbours helping each other through difficult harvests or family crises. These stories of cooperation and mutual aid would be shared around work camps in the early days, creating brief moments of warmth and connection that reminded everyone of what they had lost. But gradually, inevitably, these stories would stop being told, not because workers forgot their past lives, but because remembering became too painful to bear. The contrast between the communities they had known and the brutal isolation of wall construction was so stark that dwelling on it served no purpose beyond increasing their misery. Better to let those memories fade, to focus on the immediate demands of survival, rather than torment themselves with visions of a world that no longer existed for them. The seasonal cycles brought their own particular challenges for integrating new workers. Those who arrived in spring had the advantage of warmer weather, but faced the disadvantage of having to prove themselves during the most intensive construction season. Summer arrivals dealt with extreme heat while learning the basics of wall construction. Autumn newcomers raced to acquire survival skills before winter, while winter arrivals often died before they could adapt to the harsh conditions. Each season's new workers brought different skills and expectations based on their backgrounds. Farmers arrived during planting season, torn away from fields they would never see harvested. Craftsmen came with tools and techniques that proved useless for wall construction, but valuable for the small repairs and improvisations that kept the project functioning. Young men arrived with strength, but no experience, while older workers brought knowledge but bodies that quickly broke down under the physical demands. The wall consumed them all with equal efficiency. Strong or weak, skilled or unskilled, young or old, hopeful or resigned, they all became part of the great grinding machine that transformed human lives into stone fortifications. Their individual characteristics mattered only in determining how quickly they would be worn down and discarded, not whether they would ultimately survive the experience. The record-keeping systems that tracked worker deployment and mortality treated each new arrival as a simple unit of labor to be allocated and consumed. Names were recorded in ledgers, but only for administrative purposes. Deaths were noted as productivity losses rather than human tragedies. The bureaucracy that managed the wall project was designed to strip away any recognition of workers' individual humanity, reducing them to interchangeable components in a vast machine. But despite the systematic dehumanization, traces of individual identity persisted in small, hidden ways. Workers would carve tiny marks into stones they placed, invisible signatures that would be buried forever in the wall's structure. They would whisper the names of their children while mixing mortar, keeping alive the memory of relationships that the wall was designed to destroy. They would hum songs from their home villages while working, brief musical connections to lives they had been forced to abandon. These small acts of resistance against complete dehumanization were dangerous. Supervisors watched for signs that workers were maintaining emotional connections that might interfere with productivity. Men caught engaging in what administrators called unproductive nostalgia face punishments designed to discourage such behavior in others. The wall demanded not just physical labor, but complete psychological surrender, the abandonment of any identity beyond that of worker. The new arrivals would gradually learn to hide these human impulses, to perform the emotional numbness that the system demanded while secretly maintaining whatever fragments of their former selves they could preserve. They learned to cry silently, to grieve invisibly, to hope quietly while projecting the resigned acceptance that supervisors wanted to see. This performance of defeat was itself exhausting, adding another layer of stress to lives already pushed beyond sustainable limits. Workers had to monitor not just their physical performance, but their emotional displays, ensuring that their faces showed the right mixture of compliance and despair. Too much defiance would bring punishment, but too much despair might be seen as a sign that they were becoming unproductive and should be disposed of. The veteran workers who survived long enough became expert at this emotional theatre, displaying just enough spirit to seem useful while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as resistance. They walked a careful line between the complete breakdown that marked workers for disposal and the dangerous vitality that might threaten supervisory authority. New workers watched these veterans with a mixture of fear and fascination, seeing in their hollow eyes and mechanical movements a preview of their own future if they survived long enough. The veterans represented both hope, in that survival was possible, and despair, in showing what survival cost in terms of human dignity and emotional capacity. The integration process was complete when new workers stopped asking about home, stopped planning for the future, stopped seeing their comrades as fellow human beings rather than potential competitors for scarce resources. When they learned to calculate the caloric value of sharing food against the energy cost of compassion. When they discovered that kindness was a luxury they couldn't afford, and mercy was a weakness that could kill them. This transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. Each small compromise, each abandoned moral principle, each act of necessary selfishness wore away another piece of their former selves, until what remained was just functional enough to move stones, but empty enough to do so, without questioning the purpose or cost of their labour. The wall's administrators understood that this psychological breaking process was as important as the physical construction work. Broken men built more efficiently than hopeful ones because they wasted no energy on dreams or plans or relationships that might interfere with productivity. The systematic destruction of human spirit was not a side effect of wall construction, but one of its primary engineering achievements. And so the cycle continued, season after season, year after year. New workers arrived with their intact humanity and fresh hope. Veterans guided them through the process of abandoning both. The wall grew taller and longer, built not just from stone and mortar, but from the accumulated spiritual death of millions of men who had been transformed from human beings into construction materials. Their identities dissolved into the massive barrier they died creating. The morning air carried with it the familiar sounds of death and resignation. Somewhere in the distance, a work gang was singing. Though calling it singing was generous, it was more like a collective moan, voices worn raw by mountain air and despair, chanting a rhythm that matched the movement of hammers on stone. The melody, if you could call it that, had long since been stripped of any beauty it might have once possessed. What remained was purely functional, a way to coordinate labour, to keep dozens of men moving in unison as they shaped the rocks that would outlive them by millennia. These work songs were one of the few cultural artifacts that survived the wall's systematic destruction of human identity. But even they had been transformed by the project's demands. The lyrics that spoke of home, of harvest festivals, of children playing in village squares, had gradually been replaced by grimmer verses. Songs about endurance, about numbness, about the blessed relief that came when your shift finally ended, and you could collapse into whatever passed for sleep. New workers would sometimes try to introduce songs from their home regions, melodies that carried memories of better times and places where human life had value. But these attempts at cultural preservation rarely lasted long. The veteran workers would listen politely at first, then gradually stop participating. Not from cruelty, but from self-preservation. Music that reminded them too vividly of what they had lost was a luxury they couldn't afford, without risking complete psychological collapse. The wall had its own music now, composed of sounds that had never been heard in any village or town. The ring of hammers on stone created a percussion that echoed off mountain walls for miles in every direction. The scraping of wooden tools against rock added a harsh accompaniment. The groans and curses of exhausted men provided a vocal element that spoke of suffering too profound for traditional lyrics to capture. Even the silence had its own quality here, different from the peaceful quiet of a countryside evening or the comfortable hush of a family gathering. This was the silence of men who had forgotten how to speak to each other as human beings, who communicated only in grunts and gestures, who had learned that words were another form of energy that could be better spent on survival. The changing of the guard created its own rhythmic patterns as different shifts of supervisors took control of various work sections. Each group of overseers brought their own methods of motivation, their own preferred forms of punishment, their own tolerance levels for worker mortality. Some were genuinely sadistic, finding in their authority over desperate men an outlet for whatever cruelties had been visited upon them in their own lives. Others were simply efficient, treating worker deaths as acceptable losses in a larger calculation, no different from tools that wore out and needed replacement. These cold administrators were often more dangerous than the overtly cruel ones, because their violence was systematic rather than emotional, calculated to produce maximum productivity rather than maximum suffering, though the distinction was often meaningless from the worker's perspective. A few supervisors, usually those who were new to their positions, would arrive with intentions of treating their workers humanely. They would attempt to distribute food more fairly, allow longer rest periods, show concern for worker safety and welfare. The veteran workers learned to recognize these supervisors quickly and to avoid showing any appreciation for their kindness, because such administrators rarely lasted long in their positions. The war project's management systems had no place for compassion or humanitarian concern. Supervisors who allowed their sections to fall behind schedule because they were concerned with worker welfare were quickly replaced by more ruthless administrators. Those who tried to improve conditions for their workers found their authority undermined and their careers destroyed. The system rewarded cruelty and efficiency while punishing any deviation toward basic human decency. This created a selection process that ensured only the most callous administrators rose to positions of real authority within the wall hierarchy. Men who could watch workers die without emotion, who could calculate human suffering as just another variable in their productivity equations, who could sleep soundly after ordering punishments that would destroy families and communities they had never seen. The bureaucratic language that developed around the Wall Project reflected this systematic dehumanization. Workers weren't injured, they experienced reduced functionality. They didn't die, they were removed from active service. Families weren't destroyed, they underwent labor reallocation. The euphemisms weren't just convenient administrative shorthand, they were essential psychological tools that allowed administrators to participate in mass murder without having to confront the human reality of their actions. Reports sent to the imperial court were masterpieces of bureaucratic obfuscation, describing the wall's progress in terms of cubic yards of stone moved and linear miles of fortification completed, while barely mentioning the human cost of these achievements. When mortality rates were discussed at all, they were presented as engineering challenges rather than humanitarian crises, problems to be solved through better logistics rather than fundamental changes to the project's approach. The imperial court, insulated by layers of bureaucracy and thousands of miles of distance, received these sanitized reports and congratulated themselves on the efficiency of their great defensive project. They saw numbers that demonstrated impressive progress toward their strategic goals, while remaining completely ignorant of the rivers of blood that made such progress possible. This willful ignorance wasn't accidental. The court needed to maintain the fiction that the Wall was a glorious national project rather than a systematic program of mass murder. Officials who provided too much detail about working conditions, who wrote too vividly about the human cost of construction, found their reports edited or suppressed entirely. The truth was not just inconvenient, it was actively dangerous to the political stability that the Wall was supposed to protect. The workers themselves became complicit in this conspiracy of silence, not from any loyalty to the system that was destroying them, but from the recognition that protesting would only make their situation worse. Men who complained too loudly about conditions were assigned to the most dangerous work details. Those who tried to organize resistance found themselves facing collective punishments that affected their entire work gangs. The few letters that workers managed to send home were carefully censored, both by official postal inspectors and by the workers themselves, who knew that describing their true situation would only cause additional suffering for their families without accomplishing anything constructive. Better to write brief, vague messages about being well and working hard than to burden loved ones with truths they were powerless to change. This enforced silence created a peculiar form of psychological torture. Workers were surrounded by suffering so extreme it cried out for witness, for acknowledgement, for some form of human response. But they were forbidden from speaking about it, forced to pretend that their situation was normal and acceptable, required to perform gratitude for the opportunity to serve the imperial vision. The contradiction between the reality of their experience and the official narrative they were required to support created a form of cognitive dissonance that many workers found more difficult to bear than the physical hardships. They were being systematically destroyed while being told they were participating in something glorious. They were dying for a project that was supposed to protect Chinese civilization, while that same civilization ground them into powder. Some workers resolved this psychological conflict by embracing the official narrative completely, convincing themselves that their suffering was indeed noble and necessary. These men became some of the most effective enforcers of the system's cruelties, policing their fellow workers with the zeal of true believers who had found meaning in their own destruction. Others withdrew into themselves completely, abandoning any attempt to make sense of their situation and focusing purely on the mechanical tasks required for daily survival. These men became human machines, moving stones and mixing mortar with mechanical precision, while their consciousness retreated to some internal space where the wall couldn't reach. But perhaps the most heartbreaking were those who maintained their sanity by creating elaborate internal fantasies about their eventual return home. They would spend their brief rest periods planning reunions with families they would never see again, describing in minute detail the lives they would build after their service was complete, constructing hopeful narratives that everyone around them knew were delusions, but no one had the heart to challenge. These fantasy worlds became increasingly elaborate and detailed as the workers' physical situation deteriorated. Men who could barely lift a hammer would spend their nights planning the farms they would establish, the businesses they would build, the grandchildren they would teach the skills they had learned on the wall. The more impossible their survival became, the more vivid and specific their dreams of the future grew. The wall's administrators recognized these psychological coping mechanisms and generally tolerated them as long as they didn't interfere with productivity. Workers who maintained hope, even delusional hope, often lasted longer than those who fell into complete despair. From a management perspective, fantasy was useful as long as it motivated continued labor rather than escape attempts or resistance. But this tolerance had limits. Workers whose fantasies became too elaborate, who began to act as if their dreams were reality, who started making actual plans for departure or resistance, would find themselves quickly transferred to the most dangerous work assignments. The message was clear. Hope was acceptable as a productivity tool, but it became dangerous when it motivated actual behavior changes. The seasonal rhythms of the wall created their own psychological pressures as workers learned to measure their lives not in days or weeks, but in construction cycles. Spring brought new quotas and fresh demands for increased productivity. Summer meant the hardest work, but also the best chance of survival for those whose bodies had been weakened by winter. Autumn carried the desperate urgency of racing against weather that could halt construction for months. But winter was when the wall revealed its truest nature, when the cold stripped away all pretenses about the project's purpose and reduced everything to the simple mathematics of survival, when workers learned that the barrier they were building was not just a defense against foreign invaders, but a machine for consuming Chinese lives, a monument to imperial power built from the bones and blood of the empire's own people. The wall grew stronger with each winter's harvest of corpses, more durable with each season's accumulation of suffering. It was not just being built, it was being fed, nourished by a steady diet of human sacrifice that transformed individual tragedies into collective achievement. Every stone was mortared with tears. Every foundation was laid on graves. Every mile was measured in the distance between a worker's birthplace and the spot where his bones would rest forever. And still it grew mile by mile, death by death, season after season, as inevitable as the mountain winds and as enduring as the stones themselves. Because that was what the wall demanded. Not just labor, but transformation. Not just construction, but consumption. Not just building, but becoming. The workers weren't constructing the wall so much as they were becoming part of it, their identities dissolving into its massive structure until there was no difference between builder and built, between the human cost and the stone achievement. The wall was patient. It could wait for each worker to surrender his humanity completely, to abandon every trace of the person he had been before arriving at the construction sites. It could wait for the moment when moving stones became not just a job, but an identity, when survival became not just a goal, but the only remaining purpose in life. And when that moment came, when the transformation was complete, the wall would claim another permanent resident, not through death necessarily, though that was common enough, but through the deeper victory of turning a human being into a component of itself, a living extension of its stone and mortar structure. The workers became the wall, and the wall became eternal. The guards changed shifts with the mechanical precision of men who had learned to measure time not in hours, but in heartbeats, not in days, but in the accumulation of small deaths that marked the wall's steady progress. As evening shadows stretched across the construction sites like dark fingers reaching for the living, workers would pause in their labor just long enough to watch the sun disappear behind western peaks, knowing that each sunset brought them one day closer to joining the countless others whose bones had become part of the foundation they stood upon. But darkness on the wall was not the peaceful end of day that farmers knew in distant valleys. It was a different kind of working time, when repair crews scrambled to fix the day's damage by torchlight, when supply convoys struggled through mountain passes guided by stars, when the injured and dying were sorted from those who might still provide another day's labor. The wall never truly slept, because sleep was a luxury that emperors could not afford to grant their human building materials. Night brought its own catalogue of horrors. Workers huddled in whatever shelter they could construct from scraps, listening to the sounds of their comrades dying in the darkness. The rattling breath of men whose lungs had been destroyed by stone dust. The delirious mumbling of fever victims whose bodies were fighting infections they had no strength to overcome. The sudden silence when another heart simply stopped beating, worn out by demands no human body was designed to sustain. In winter, these night sounds were muffled by snow and wind, creating an eerie quiet that was somehow more disturbing than the obvious suffering of warmer months. Men would freeze to death without making a sound, their bodies simply shutting down as they slept, pressed against their comrades for warmth that was never quite enough. Morning would reveal them still in position, eyes closed peacefully, but rigid and cold as the stones they had spent their lives moving. The morning ritual of checking for survivors became as routine as any other administrative task. Overseers would move through the camps with the efficiency of accountants, making quick assessments of which workers could still be productive and which had become obstacles to be disposed of. The living would be roused with kicks and curses, while the dead would be dragged away to join the day's construction materials. This casual integration of corpses into the building process had become so normalized that workers no longer flinched when they were ordered to use their dead comrades as foundation fill. The bodies were just another resource to be allocated efficiently, no different from stones or timber, or the clay that bound everything together into a structure that would outlast empires. The wall was not just built on human sacrifice. It was built from human sacrifice, transformed into stone and mortar through alchemy of imperial will. The few workers who survived multiple seasons developed a strange relationship with this process of human transformation. They learned to see their own bodies as temporary vessels that would eventually be consumed by the wall's insatiable appetite for building materials. This wasn't morbid acceptance exactly, but a kind of practical resignation that allowed them to continue functioning while surrounded by evidence of their own inevitable fate. Some found comfort in the idea that their deaths would serve a permanent purpose, that their bones would become part of something that might endure for thousands of years. It was a form of immortality, they told themselves, even if it was an immortality without identity, without recognition, without any trace of the individual who'd been consumed to create it. Better to become part of something eternal than to simply disappear into unmarked graves that would be forgotten within a generation. Others were tormented by the thought that their suffering would be permanently embedded in the wall's structure, that future generations would unknowingly walk over their bones while admiring the achievement those bones had made possible. They imagined tourists from distant times and places, people who would see only beauty and engineering prowess, where they should see the accumulated agony of millions of forgotten workers. But such philosophical reflections were luxuries that few could afford for long. The immediate demands of survival left little energy for contemplating the meaning or legacy of their situation. Workers learned to focus on the next stone, the next breath, the next moment of not being selected for disposal, because thinking beyond those immediate concerns led to the kind of despair that made continued existence impossible. The wall's construction had created its own ecosystem of scavengers and parasites, both human and otherwise. Merchants appeared at remote construction sites, selling overpriced food and tools to workers who had nothing left to trade but their lives. Guards supplemented their incomes by selling access to better work assignments or slightly larger food rations. Even the local wildlife had adapted to the constant supply of human corpses, with carrion birds and mountain predators learning to follow the sound of construction because it invariably led to easy meals. This ecosystem of exploitation extended far beyond the construction sites themselves. Villages along supply routes discovered they could profit from the steady stream of human misery flowing toward the wall. Some became specialized in providing replacement workers when mortality rates exceeded projections. Others focused on processing the personal effects of the dead, sorting through the meager possessions left behind by workers and recycling them back into the system. The bureaucratic apparatus that managed this vast enterprise had grown into a kind of parallel government with its own hierarchies, territories, and methods of extracting wealth from human suffering. Officials who had started as minor functionaries found themselves controlling resources and wielding power that rivaled provincial governors, all built on their ability to transform living people into construction materials efficiently and profitably. Records from this period, fragmentary as they are, reveal the casual brutality with which human life was discussed in administrative contexts. Workers were referred to as units of construction capacity that could be depreciated over time and eventually written off when they became non-functional. The language itself had been weaponized to strip away any recognition of the humanity being systematically destroyed. But language has a way of preserving truth, even when truth is being deliberately obscured. The euphemisms and bureaucratic terminology that administrators used to describe their work betrayed the reality they were trying to hide. You don't need euphemisms for acceptable activities. You don't need elaborate linguistic disguises for processes you're proud of. The very attempt to sanitize the language revealed the horror that lay beneath the administrative surface. Workers developed their own vocabulary to describe their experiences, words and phrases that captured aspects of their situation that official language was designed to ignore. They had terms for different types of despair, specific words for the various stages of physical breakdown, elaborate classifications for the methods supervisors used to extract maximum productivity before disposal. This underground language became one of the few ways workers could maintain some sense of shared identity and mutual understanding. These linguistic innovations spread along the wall's length through the informal networks that connected different construction sites. Workers would carry new words and expressions with them when they were transferred between sections, creating a kind of cultural continuity that survived even as the people who created it were consumed by the project they served. The wall had its own dialect, born from suffering and refined by the need to communicate experiences that no previous generation had ever faced. Songs, too, evolved to carry meanings that couldn't be expressed in ordinary conversation. Work, chants that sounded like simple coordination tools, contained hidden messages about survival techniques, warnings about particularly dangerous supervisors, even coded information about escape routes that might exist in specific regions. This musical code allowed workers to share crucial knowledge while maintaining the appearance of compliance that their survival required. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this underground culture was how quickly it adapted to changing conditions. As new forms of suffering were introduced, new vocabulary emerged to describe them. When administrative methods evolved, the workers' linguistic responses evolved with them. The wall was constantly changing, and the human culture it generated changed with it, always staying one step ahead of the system's attempts to eliminate any form of worker solidarity or communication. This cultural creativity was itself a form of resistance, though not one that directly challenged the wall's construction or the system that supported it. Workers were creating something that belonged to them, something that couldn't be taken away or incorporated into official productivity metrics. They were maintaining their humanity not through rebellion, but through the simple act of continuing to think and feel and communicate as human beings rather than as construction equipment. The administrators noticed this cultural activity, but generally tolerated it as long as it didn't interfere with work quotas. In some cases, they even encouraged it, recognizing that workers who maintained some sense of identity and community often lasted longer than those who fell into complete despair. From a management perspective, culture was useful as long as it served the larger purpose of keeping human construction materials functional for as long as possible. But this tolerance had its limits, and workers learned to be careful about how openly they expressed their shared identity. Too much solidarity could be interpreted as potential for organized resistance. Too much cultural activity could suggest that workers were wasting energy that should be devoted to construction. The line between acceptable human expression and dangerous group behavior was constantly shifting, and workers had to navigate it with the same care they used to avoid physical dangers on the construction sites. The wall consumed not just individual lives but entire ways of life, cultural traditions that had existed for centuries, knowledge systems that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen and farmers and storytellers. When communities were emptied of their adult men, the cultural practices that required their participation simply disappeared. Folk traditions died not from persecution, but from the simple absence of the people who had kept them alive. This cultural destruction was perhaps more permanent than the physical deaths that accompanied it. Bodies decomposed and were forgotten, but the loss of cultural knowledge represented a form of amnesia that affected entire regions of China. Future generations would grow up not just without their fathers and grandfathers, but without the songs, stories, crafts and customs that those men had carried with them to their deaths on the wall. The wall's cultural impact extended even to regions that provided no workers for its construction. The massive resource drain required to support the project affected trade patterns, agricultural practices, and social structures throughout the empire. Communities that had never seen the wall found their lives shaped by its demands as taxation, conscription, and economic reorganization rippled outward from the construction sites, like shockwaves from an explosion. But perhaps most tragically, the wall succeeded in one of its unspoken purposes. It demonstrated to the Chinese people that their individual lives had no value compared to imperial ambitions. Every family that lost a father or son to the wall's construction learned that human beings were expendable resources to be consumed at the emperor's pleasure. Every community that was stripped of its young men learned that traditional ways of life could be destroyed overnight if they conflicted with state priorities. This lesson in powerlessness was perhaps more valuable to the imperial system than any defensive capability the wall might have provided. A population that understood its complete vulnerability to state violence was less likely to challenge imperial authority in other contexts. The wall served as a constant reminder of what could happen to those who forgot their place in the imperial hierarchy. The workers themselves became unwilling teachers of this lesson when the few survivors eventually returned to their home communities. They carried with them not just physical scars and broken bodies, but psychological damage that affected everyone they encountered. Their families learned that love and loyalty meant nothing when weighed against imperial demands. Their children learned that fathers could simply disappear forever, consumed by projects they had no say in and no ability to refuse. These returning survivors, broken as they were, represented both hope and despair for their communities. Hope because they proved that survival was possible, that the wall didn't necessarily mean death for everyone it consumed. But despair because they showed what survival cost, what had to be sacrificed to endure the experience of being transformed from a human being into a construction material, and somehow retaining enough identity to return home. The stories these survivors told, when they could bring themselves to tell them at all, became part of Chinese folklore, cautionary tales that parents would whisper to their children about the price of imperial ambition and the cost of challenging forces too large to resist. But these stories were told quietly, carefully, because even the memory of the wall's construction carried dangers for those who spoke too openly about what it had really involved. And so the wall grew, not just in length and height, but in cultural significance, becoming a symbol of what the imperial system was capable of demanding from its subjects. It stood as a monument, not just to Chinese engineering capabilities, but to the complete subordination of individual human dignity to state power. Every stone represented not just a defensive barrier, but a lesson in obedience, a reminder carved in rock of what happened to those who were chosen to serve imperial visions. The wall endures today, winding across the mountains of northern China like a dragon made of stone and bones, attracting millions of tourists who come to admire its grandeur and marvel at its construction. They walk along pathways built on unmarked graves, taking photographs of vistas that were created by the systematic destruction of millions of human lives, celebrating an achievement that represents one of history's greatest monuments to organized cruelty. But perhaps that's fitting, because the wall was always intended to be a monument to power rather than a practical fortification. It was built not because China needed it, but because China could build it, because the imperial system had the capacity to transform human beings into building materials on an industrial scale. The suffering of the workers was not an unfortunate byproduct of construction, but an essential element of the wall's purpose, proof of the emperor's absolute authority over the lives of his subjects. Today, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, surrounded by the safety and security that previous generations could barely imagine, perhaps you can spare a thought for those millions of forgotten workers whose bones rest in the foundations of one of the world's most famous landmarks. They were not heroes or volunteers or willing participants in some great national project. They were ordinary people who were ground up in the machinery of imperial ambition so that emperors could feel secure and tourists could take selfies against a backdrop of organized suffering transformed into scenic beauty. The Great Wall of China stands as humanity's longest cemetery, a memorial not to the glory of empire, but to the human cost of unchecked power and unlimited ambition. It reminds us that some achievements are too expensive to celebrate, some monuments too blood-soaked to admire without remembering the price that was paid by people who had no choice in the matter and no voice in its telling. Sleep well, knowing that the wall still stands, still remembers, still carries within its stones the weight of all those lives that were consumed to build it. And perhaps, in your dreams, you might hear the echo of work songs drifting across ancient mountains, the voices of men who built something that would outlast them by millennia, while knowing they would never live to see it completed, never return to the families they left behind, never be remembered for anything except their contribution to a monument that was designed to erase their very existence. The wall endures, the workers are gone, but their story, finally, can be told.